Okay, thank you so much, Holly, and also thank you greatly to, excuse me, everyone who is here today. I am so excited to be able to share this research, and I hope you forgive me if the excitement spills over into sort of a level of sassiness and maybe disorganization that I tend to bring to things like this, but I know that I'm getting a lot of invites, so sorry. It just keeps popping up, people being wanting to be admitted. So I'm glad to be here with the people that I consider to be my people who will, I think, welcome this kind of bad sociological research warmly. But at the same time, when you do something a little bit bad, I think you can expect resistance, and that is part of the hope, the promise, and the challenge. So if this is too bad for you, feel free to put a thumbs down in the chat, and then we can talk about it. So I'm talking to you today about research that I've been doing since 2019. Excuse me. Some of this is pandemic research. And in the past few years, I've really been able to kind of spread my wings and open up what this research has entailed. And that is really fundamentally because of the support that I have received from KPU. The title of my talk, as Holly said, is that Rocks Are Time Tellers, a bad sociology of fossils and BC's Burgess Shale. And there's a picture there of me at the Burgess Shale. And for those of my friends in the audience that don't know what or where the Burgess Shale is, I just want to highlight before I go in to explain what this place is, that standing there was no easy feat to achieve. It is an extremely difficult and grueling hike, if I do say so myself. Okay, so I want to start with the land acknowledgement to say that at Kwantlen we are living, working, studying in unceded, traditional, and ancestral Indigenous territories of the Kwantlen, the Musqueam, the Katzie, the Semiahmoo, the Tawasin, the Kaikait, and the Coquitlam people. And I, excuse me, I am calling to you from, as I understand it, a place of convergence and meeting of the Katzie, the Tawasin, the Kwantlen, the Semiahmoo, and the Stolo. The Burgess Shale is located in Yoho National Park, which is on the territory of the Kitunaha and Secwepemc. And I do territorial acknowledgement in the context of this research because it is really fundamentally important to actually the praxis and the spirit and the outcomes of this research to signify that the places that I'm studying have changed shape in sometimes violent ways, and we are encouraged to remember the time immemorial presence of Indigenous peoples on these lands. It is also important to note that colonialism has fundamentally shaped the history of paleontological science, and paleontology is also a part of the colonial history of North America in particular. And I can talk a little bit about that to kind of preface more about why I think it's important to do the land acknowledgement in the context of this talk about the Burgess Shale. A couple of examples, you might be familiar with the Royal BC Museum in Victoria and the controversy around spending almost $800 million to redesign it in the spirit of decolonization. And if you go to the Royal BC Museum, you will see that it does have quite a colonial messaging. So, for example, talking about first fossils ever discovered in BC, strictly by Western scientists or Western science, the idea of our ancestors and no exploration of who those ancestors might be, and this idea that British Columbia is a place of naturalized migration, that migration is just fully fundamental to the placeness of BC. And that controversy obviously resulted in the canceling of that project. So I'm not too sure what the future of the Royal BC Museum will be. But this is kind of a local example of that. There's also the colonial history, particularly in the United States, And one of my sort of favorite things to read about and explore is the so-called bone wars between Cope and Marsh, these sort of turn-of-the-century paleontologists who were really sort of moving westward, collecting dinosaur bones and competing with each other under sort of this egotistical, like masculinist science. And sometimes they would find fossils that they felt they couldn't actually dig up and ship back to the east coast of the United States, so they would dynamite them. They would also, kill bison for sport and fun. And so just thinking about how a sort of discovery and land claims and exploring the land and moving west was part of the colonial process. And we can see how the history of paleontology features into that. So that really is the purpose of my land acknowledgement, is not just to say, hey, we're here, but also to say that this is informing the research. So what have I been doing? The broader research project is called Trilobite Time Towards a Sociology of Paleontology. And so far I have, well, the first thing I'll say that I have done is I actually found a fossil in my backyard. And this is a fossil, well, it's a, what do they call it? Conglomerate? Perry is here, he'll know. It's got Bukia fossils in it. So these are like clams. You can see that there. And I was just looking around my yard, like regular day, and I looked down and I saw a fossil in my yard. And I really couldn't believe that the goddess of rocks chose me that day, or why she would place a fossil in my backyard. And I have two theories about how this fossil ended up there. One is that it is detritus brought down by glacial movements, possibly related to Harrison Lake deposits of Bukia. And the second one is that this came hauled in on a river rock or other types of rock that became landscaping rock in my property. So if it's the case that this rock is actually a landscaping rock, then it is as much a technology as it is a rock, which is important to the research that I'm doing, to kind of collapse this idea that there's nature on one side and humans on the other side, and humans sort of owning and creating using technology, and everyone else. Okay, Perry says it's a concretion. Yeah. So just so my friends here know, Perry is the president of the Vancouver Paleontological Society, which is an amateur paleontology club that I really love. So anyway, I discovered this. I discovered it, right? That's how we talk about fossils in my backyard. But since then, I've done 30 days roughly of ethnographic research in many different paleontological fora, including like conferences, symposia, but also museums, collections, laboratories. I've done 5 museum and collections studies, museum walkthrough studies, and been spent a week or two in some collections. I've done 14 interviews so far, and I have plans to do about, I'm thinking maybe 11 more, because that's who I've lined up. There probably will be more. I've done some analysis. I am going to the Smithsonian National what's it called? National Natural History Museum, something like that. I forget what it's called, but that is one of the most significant collections of fossils from the Burgess Shale. I'm going there in April, and I've submitted an article, and I have started writing a book, which is ultimately the goal of this project, called Trilobite Time: Fossils in the Epoch of Humans. And I mentioned that I had also done some sort of pandemic-inspired research, which meant that I couldn't go anywhere. And of course, paleontology is a field science. So what I did was I created some artworks. These are clay or ceramic trilobites with symbols on top. So I was just trying to kind of explore, what does it mean to be a rock? And, as you know, pottery is actually just sort of rocks, right? So I made some of these kind of things to keep connected to my research in the midst of the pandemic, and also I had a baby. So before I hop in even more into like what this research entails and the main arguments that I want to present today, I want to really acknowledge that this research is fully from my heart, my spirit, and my love of research, and the curious spirit that I bring to research that doesn't really have limits, particularly the limits of discipline, which is related to this idea of bad sociology. And I want to say that doing this research is a complete dream come true. Probably every single person here has this memory, or even more so, of a phase of life where you loved dinosaurs. Maybe you still love dinosaurs. And I feel so privileged that I get to be 42-year-old me working at Kwantlen Polytechnic University with all of this support, being able to turn a childhood love into something that I can do professionally. So I really want to thank my research assistants and my colleagues and Kwantlen for all of the amazing support in making these dreams of mine come true. So, what is sociology? If we're going to figure out whether the sociology is bad or not, we need to know what sociology is. And I teach Intro to Sociology. I probably taught it, I don't know, dozens of times. And this is one of the slides that I would share. You know, sociology is a study of social life, social change, and the social causes and consequences of human behavior. So there's a lot of social in sociology. What do sociologists do? They investigate the structures of groups, organizations, and societies and how people interact within these contexts. Now, you'll just note here that there is no mention of dinosaurs. So a sociologist of paleontology would need to figure out how are they going to be a sociologist while looking at literally completely dead ancient critters. They're so dead that they're rocks. But rocks are actually alive. Let's find out how. So two outrageous things that I am I'm playing around with. The first is that this is a bad sociology, and it's because I don't really embrace this figuration of what sociology is. I think sociology is and can be more than that. And also, the second outrageous thing is that rocks are time tellers. Wait, sorry. I feel like my screen. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm sorry. I had animations and I didn't know how to make them work. Okay, so rocks are time tellers. So typically we think about communicating as being distinctly a thing that is done by living creatures. And in particular, we think of humans as predominantly only having language. So one that relates or communicates, one that reckons or counts. To say that a rock does that, I think is a pretty radical thing considering the intuitive and sort of hegemonic understanding of what language is and what communication is and what a teller can be. So what would a good sociology of paleontology be? I decided not to ask the humans, but the robots. So I asked ChatGPT back in the summer, hey, what would a good sociology of paleontology look like? And you can see here that what this list talks about is really looking at the ways in which science is a feature of culture and how culture and science interact with each other, how science is a form of culture, and also how science informs broader social interests like political debates, economic considerations, and that kind of thing. So we're looking at sociocultural context, social construction of knowledge, collaboration, gender and other forms of diversity, public engagement, and as we know, paleontology is definitely a very public-facing science. Social justice, science policy and ethics, social change, education, social networks. So a lot of this really is about the people of paleontology, which obviously I'm very interested in because I'm still a sociologist, but I don't know, I mean, it's pretty human-centric. And one of the things that I have learned from studying paleontology is that the level of hubris that humans have to think that we're the center of the universe and that fossils from, you know, the Ediacaran all the way up until very more recent fossils, they have seen it all on the planet. And that history is miles and miles longer than the minor blip that humans have spent on this earth. So I think that paleontology is particularly humbling for sociology, which is very human-centered. And I think this is probably why sociologists really love the concept of the Anthropocene, and I'm really interested to see the talk coming up next in the series about the Anthropocene and how that concept is addressed in that particular talk. But what we see is that there are tons and tons of sociological research and other types of social scientific research on this idea of the Anthropocene, right? That we are living in an era, a geological and climatic era, where the dominant driver of change is sourced by human action, as opposed to other types of sources of change, like, I don't know, a volcano or earthquakes or a meteor hitting the earth. But what I found, which was really interesting for me as a sociologist when I went to talk to paleontologists, is that paleontologists are divided, but also there's like a strong sense of not being that keen on the Anthropocene concept. And so I found that really interesting because before I started research with paleontologists, I thought they would be all over it. So what is the Anthropocene? This is a concept that says that humans have become a geological agent, profoundly shaping the Earth in ways that warrant the naming of a new planetary epoch, the Anthropocene, or the era of humans. And this is so interesting because, again, this really centers humans like at the center of the universe. Like, this is the era of us. But what does it mean? Is it really the era of us? And the planet that we are living on, is it ours? And we have seen many, many creatures on this planet come and go, come and go. And so that level of humility that you feel when you look at it like an enormous, like say like a brachiosaur that walked this planet and experienced this planet in the same spaces that you now occupy. It kind of makes you wonder, what does it mean to be living in the era of humans? Is this really our era? Or is that just another way for humans to claim superiority and to claim dominance over our planet, which is naturally changing? So I have some excerpts here from some of my participants so you can kind of see how some of them feel about this idea of the Anthropocene. So this person says, it's not valid in terms of geology, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have meaning. I mean, it's never going to be a geological stage, because geology is based, well, partly, yes, as you can see here, there's some hesitation. There's relative stratigraphy based on fossils. So in that case, there might be a relative stratigraphy that can be defined with the Anthropocene. Okay, granted, but it's too small to correspond to major geological changes. But in the end, I don't think the debate is worth whether the Anthropocene has to be recognized as a unit or not. I don't think this has any consequence, because maybe we can talk about this again in 5 million years. Yeah, from a deep time perspective. But then the Anthropocene, the only way I can talk about it is in a non-paleontological way. It's more historical and philosophical, which is really interesting, because that means that myself as a sociologist, I can really play a little bit more with this concept of Anthropocene than it might seem. Here's another one. There's an element of magnificent hubris of humans to think that we are capable of changing the world in such profound ways. Now, for my friends who are ecologically minded, this might be a little bit scary, right? It resonates with climate change denialism in a way, right? Like if we say, oh yeah, we're not really capable of changing the world in that way, and the geological record tells us that, and it will tell us that 500 million years in the future, then that kind of makes us go, well, what's the point? What's the point of trying to save the planet, work on the planet to mitigate climate change? And so when I kind of realized that paleontologists were more ambivalent about the Anthropocene concept than I thought they would be, I got a little bit scared. I was like, oh, this is really, I mean, can I even say this? Like, can I say, maybe this concept is like, is problematic, because it's a very powerful concept in helping us conceptualize what we are doing in and on our planet today. So I think that this really raises some much bigger ontological questions, which are my favorite kind of questions. What does it mean to be human? And I really realized that this is fundamentally a paleontological question as much as it is a sociological one. So it's clearly a sociological question. What does it mean to be human? This is our object of study, our typical object of study. And paleontologists study extinct creatures prior to the Holocene, which is our current geological epoch. Again, like why are we studying ancient life on the planet? It's because we want to understand what is happening to us today. There is a continuity between understanding the history and understanding the contemporary life. And so these queries are really fundamentally related. So what I realized studying paleontologists and paleontology is that paleontologies are stories of ancient life, but they are also stories of us. And anything that tells stories of us is definitely of interest to me sociologically. So what I think the world needs now is bad sociology. We need to do a good job of bad sociology, which is to decenter a non-human-centric sociology where ecological insights are incorporated with the perspectives of the Anthropocene and deep time. And so that means we need to think about what it means to be a human on the planet, not just through the presentist lens, not through the historical lens, not through the prehistorical lens, but through the lens of deep time. That there is something fundamental about ancient life that is also the same story of us and vice versa. So what is deep time? Deep time is a corollary concept to the idea of deep space, which you are probably familiar with. And just as unimaginably vast distances must be conceptualized to understand the universe, like how far is a light year? How far is a million light years? We need to somehow be able to picture that to understand, hey, our planet's here now. Why is our planet here now? What does that mean? And we're getting into like really big ideas and even cosmologies and spiritual ideas as well, alongside scientific ones. So just as we have to figure, okay, how can I imagine a light year? That's like physically impossible for me. How can I picture millions upon millions upon millions of years into the past? And that concept of like trying to squeeze your brain to think about that is captured in the notion of deep time. So what do we want to do? So we're trying to imagine a planet where there were no humans. There wasn't even an apple in the eye of any idea that there could be a human anywhere on the planet. Humans are just like a very magical coincidence of existence that we happen to evolve the way that we did out of a bunch of incidences that made, you know, the rise of mammals possible on the planet. So what does it mean to think about the deep time of a critter? Like, how can you think about the world of a critter that lived 500 million years ago? So I like to turn to what Richard Fortey wrote about in this incredible book that has a exclamation point in the title, which is vibes, Trilobite, Eyewitness to Evolution. And he has this, what he calls unabashedly trilobitocentric view of the world. And that is the non-human centric view of the world that I'm trying to take. I want to look through the eyes of the trilobite at the world that it saw and it continues to see in the form of fossils or artworks like this trilobite, or through these wonderful replicas that I have here. I mean, trilobites are my favorite critter. I want to invest the trilobite with all the glamour of the dinosaur. And unfortunately, if you thought I was going to talk about dinosaurs, I'm not, because I'm definitely a dino nerd, but I'm really more of an ancient arthropod nerd. And twice as endurance. I want you to see the world through the eyes of trilobites to help you make a journey back through hundreds of millions of years. And trilobites had incredible eyes and diverse eyes and eyes made of types of stuff and crystals that we don't see today. Come see the world as it once was through the crystal eyes of the trilobite. Through trilobites, we shall take possession of the geological past. Interesting. That's a kind of interesting turn of hubris there too. This will be an unabashedly trilobitocentric view of the world. So what do we do if I want to take a trilobitocentric view of my world now? How would I do that? So the central case study of the research that I'm doing and the book that I am attempting to write is the Burgess Shale. So the Burgess Shale is located in the Rocky Mountains in Yoho National Park. You can see there on the map, it might be a little bit small for you, but it's basically, if you drive west from Calgary for about, what is it, Perry, like about 2.5 hours to get from Calgary to the Burgess Shale? Oh, my friend Perry, he's trying to unmute. Anyway, I remember it being about 2.5 hours to drive. Yeah, 2 hours? Yeah, a 2-hour drive. And it's really interesting, actually, when you drive from Calgary to the Burgess Shale, because you go from the flat prairies of Alberta, and then suddenly you're in the Rocky Mountains, and it's like this totally different experience of what the place is offering in terms of the way that the sort of the phenomenology of it. This is a layer of rock that was once a tropical seafloor just north of the equator over 500 million years ago. So 500 million years ago is a very, very long time, hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs roamed the planet. And meanwhile, so 500 million years ago, there was a tropical seafloor. And meanwhile, the Canadian Pacific Railway was reaching a point as it was driven westward by racialized labor, mainly Chinese laborers, to the Rocky Mountains and to the Kicking Horse Valley. And with that came the Geological Survey of Canada and a geologist, R.C. McConnell, who went for a hike on Mount Stephen and found trilobite fossils. And this attracted the attention of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and Charles Walcott, who decided to go for some hikes in the area looking at the Cambrian outcrop and found some stuff. He found some pretty interesting stuff. He found some stuff that actually blew everyone's mind because of the nature of the fossils that are in this place. It really cannot be overstated how like mind-blowing and sensational these fossils are for a few different reasons. One of them is that they exemplify this notion of the Cambrian explosion, or this idea that there was sort of this time in the history of this planet where suddenly like nature was trying everything and tons of different types of critters emerged out of what was before just a few simple things. And the other thing that's really incredible about the Burgess Shale is that soft tissues were preserved. So typically fossilization will only preserve hard tissues like bones and shells. But in this case, you could actually see some of the eyes of the critters. You could see like their last meal. They had like their little stomachs, their little anuses. And on top of that, there's two other things that's incredible about the Burgess Shale. The density of fossils is like remarkable. Like it's mind-blowing. When you're there, you can just sit down, turn over a piece of rock, there's a fossil. Every single piece, it feels like you turn over. It's just fossils everywhere. And my friends, I don't know if you've ever tried to find a fossil, but it's like not that easy. So the density is amazing. And then as you can see, some of these critters were pretty wild. My favorite is at the top left, which is Opabinia. My Opabinia friend had 5 eyes and this kind of arm thing that would like feed its mouth maybe. I mean, look at this critter. Like it looks like it's like from an alien planet. And then there's Anomalocaris. I think I have one here. Where's my, oh yeah, here's Anomalocaris with this sort of like these, I don't know, these jaw things. Like these were real creatures. This was the apex predator. And then Hallucigenia, which is in the middle, and it's, I guess, a kind of a worm thing. And for a long time, paleontologists weren't sure which was the top and which was the bottom, which was the legs and which was the spikes, and it was depicted upside down for a really long time. So Hallucigenia, as in like hallucinate, Anomalocaris, as in anomaly. These critters are sensational and they're mind-blowing and they're unlike anything that we really see on our planet today, in my opinion. So we have this place, the Burgess Shale, and then I sometimes try to be a good sociologist and ask like basic sociological questions, like what are the beliefs, assumptions, and concepts that people bring to this place? So my first question is, where is this place? So we know from this map, which is a map of, it depicts a colonial history of these places. We know from this map where the Burgess Shale is from a colonial perspective and from a 2023 perspective, which is that it is in the Rocky Mountains. And I went to this place. This is me. That's my husband. We're at the Burgess Shale. You can see here, this is a piece of a trilobite. I think that's trilobite 2. I can't really see what that is. I don't remember. But you can see here that, and it's just so beautiful up there. I mean, just like gorgeous, wonderful place to get to. And so it's in the Rocky Mountains, but like where actually is this place? So it's not actually that easy to say, okay, the Burgess Shale is in British Columbia, for example. It is in the provincial borders of British Columbia. But if you want to go to the Burgess Shale, the best way to do it probably is to go to Calgary first. And as we know, Alberta is very well known for its fossil resources and its museums and Drumheller, and it's some really incredible fossil discoveries. And Drumheller is called the dinosaur capital of the world. That is in Alberta. And in fact, Drumheller is about like an hour and 45 minutes from Calgary. So you could go from Drumheller, which is a dino place, to the Burgess Shale in like 4 hours. I mean, you'd have to take the hike, but I mean, to the town of Fields, right? So they're quite close. In fact, if you want to go from the Royal BC Museum, which is, you know, one of the main places that the natural history of BC is depicted, it would take you all day or more to get there. So you will know that the Rocky Mountains has its own kind of placeness, and it's phenomenologically so different from other places in BC and other places in Alberta. And it really feels like you are transitioning between these places, that there's a blurring between these places, and that if I wanted to go to a place in British Columbia, I would need to go to Alberta first, which is a very interesting experience. The Alberta tourism supports the work that's done in the visitor site in the Burgess Shale. And I asked a participant who lived in the region and was working for Travel Alberta while working at the Infield, which is the town closest to the Burgess Shale. And I said, hey, is this in BC or Alberta? Like, what kind of place is this? And he said, well, this is an intersection. It's more connected to the Rockies as its own kind of region. In addition to being its own kind of region that's sort of half owned in different ways by BC and in different ways by Alberta, it is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which means it's a place belonging to the world. And there's this idea ascribed to it that it is our legacy of the past, what we live with today and what we pass on to future generations, our cultural and natural heritage, the source of life and inspiration. And you can see here that you're not just allowed to go to the Burgess Shale. Like, you can't just go there. In fact, the whole place is covered by cameras. I don't even understand how that works, but when you go there, you can kind of see them. And our guide told us, I don't know if this is true, by the way, but our guide told us that the cameras that cover the shale can zoom in as small as the eraser of a pencil to see, because these sites are protected. You cannot collect there and you can't destroy anything. You have to leave everything just as you found it. So the only way to get up there is through a licensed guide. In addition to it being a place of the world, a place of BC, and a place of Alberta, it is also up. To get to the shale, you have to hike up the whole time. Up, up, up. A good 7 hours in the thin mountain air, more than 2,000 meters above sea level across heterogeneous terrain, tons of different types of terrain to get over. And so what does it mean to be human? I will say from personal experience, it means suffering, because this was the most grueling day of my life and I have given birth twice. Just to put that into perspective, how difficult I found it. But I did make it. So that was really incredible. So where is the Burgess Shale? In addition to being in Canada, on Turtle Island as well, in the Rocky Mountains, BC, Alberta, the Burgess Shale, the place that we know what this is. Yeah, Julia says she did it and she regretted it. And Perry said it was phenomenal as well. It's actually a somewhat of a pilgrimage for paleontologists too. It's one of their bucket lists, a very common bucket list place to go. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so the place that we understand this Burgess Shale. Okay, so what is this place and where is it? It's also actually in a bunch of far-flung places. And that is because all of these fossils are thousands. Like I think the Smithsonian has 60,000 and then the ROM has 80 to 100,000 specimens from the Burgess Shale. These are pieces of rock that have fossils on them. And interestingly, there are practically none at the Royal BC Museum. So that kind of tells you about this, the fossil heritage in British Columbia and what type of fossils are recognized as important to be stored in British Columbia. At the Royal BC Museum, I saw like a tiny drawer of teaching specimens from the Burgess Shale, but there's no collection there and they don't have anything on display. And in fact, last time I looked, I did not see even any mention of the Burgess Shale in the Royal BC Museum, even though the Burgess Shale is considered one of, if not the most fantastic fossil site in the entire world. So the things that we know about the Burgess Shale from the study of fossils are from fossils that live somewhere else. Predominantly, they live in the Royal Ontario Museum, the Smithsonian, and some in the Royal Tyrrell, and then there's small scattered teaching collections. And this is really related to the unfolding interests of different paleontological groups gaining access to the ability to collect from the Burgess Shale. And it just really hasn't been something that the Royal BC Museum has engaged in. So the meaning of the place of the Burgess Shale is tied up in these really far-flung places in Washington, D.C. and in Ontario in particular. So I've asked several times, where is the Burgess Shale? And I've tried to elaborate that it's in a ton of different places. But from a paleontological perspective, one of the things that I argue, and I have had a little bit of resistance from my paleontologist friends through this argumentation, so I'm really interested to explore it more and develop it more in the book that I'm trying to write. If you're going to ask where, you also have to ask when. Those are two at least linked questions, if not, in my argumentation, really the same question. Because when you say, where is the Burgess Shale, it really depends what time period you're looking at to figure out where that place would be. Well, when is a place in a different spot? In 500 million years, the Burgess Shale has moved dramatically. This used to be an equatorial place in a continent, and it was a sea floor, right? It was below sea level. Now it's above. I mean, the contrast is just so sensational to think about that contrast of being a sea floor all the way up to the Rocky Mountains. Like, how tasty is that contrast? And my friends here know that I love thinking about dualisms. This continent that it was on, this sort of like supercontinent, was called Laurentia. You can kind of see here the contemporary map of Alberta and some other places there laid over top of the Laurentia. And so it's now more than 6,000 kilometers from where it first was laid down. In paleontology, they actively and comfortably use this sort of hybrid or portmanteau concept in the geologic timescale. And so the idea is that layers of rock were laid down and they tell time. So a lower layer of rock is a more ancient rock than a layer of rock that is on top of it. So you can actually date layers of rock by looking at their relationship to each other in a stratigraphic column. And you can also see that in addition to dating rocks of layers of rock in terms of how they are have a relationship to each other, You can also date layers of rock and date fossils by looking at what's called biostratigraphy. So like, where do you find which critters in what layers of rock? So there is this relationship between fossils, where are they found in the layers of rock, time, and place. And all of these things coalesce in rocks telling us something about the ancient past. So there is this hybridization of place, time, and life that is wonderfully embraced in paleontology that we really don't typically see in in sciences of the modern, sciences of contemporary life. So if you see a trilobite fossil in a layer of rock, you know it's going to be really, really ancient. If you see a dinosaur, it's not as ancient. There is a telling of time. And the rock layers themselves tell time. So you would talk about a layer of rock being Cambrian. That is a time that is ascribed to that rock. The rock tells the time and the time tells the rock. So what I'm trying to argue here is that we are never only in one place. That place is not just a spatial and cultural concept like Surrey, KPU, my neighborhood, right? Like these aren't just human concepts, but it's also a temporal concept. Like if you say I'm in Surrey, well, like when is that? They actually have to think about the whenness of place. And typically the whenness is quite hegemonic in terms of a presentist understanding, right? So like it's Surrey now, but several hundred years ago, that Surrey wasn't a place. It was someone else's place that had meanings and habitus and culture and life. And the other argument that I want to make is that the timeline for thinking about the temporality of a place is non-linear. So I'm just walking around my house, or sorry, my yard in Surrey, and then you know who intrudes upon my enjoyment of my yard is this concretion, right? This bukia. I think, what was it? Are they 120 million years old, Perry? The bukia from Harrison? He's going to type it in the chat. I think they're roughly 120 million years old. And it said to me, hey, this place is also ancient. And what does it mean to have an ancient rock in your hand? I know this is like 100 million year old rock, because the fossils tell me that. So suddenly I'm like, whoa, what does it mean to be walking around in my yard in Surrey? And the level of privilege and the kinds of violence that made it possible for me to be walking around in a piece of land and say that it's mine, like that I own it. And then I'm going to take this rock and say that I own it and put it on my desk and keep it as a cherished object. The timeline is non-linear. Fossils will not let the timeline be linear, and they will not let it be just of the present. The Burgess Shale is at once in and not in. Yeah, so Perry says 100 million years old, Bukia. Perry says brought by the glaciers. Definitely bought by the glaciers, but I think it's in my yard because of it being a landscape technology. I don't know. The Burgess Shale is at once in and not in British Columbia, Alberta, or Canada at all. The British Columbianness, Albertaness, and Canadianness of the Burgess Shale is still integral to the idea of it as a place, right? That's how we claim ownership over a place and say, this is ours. This is a BC place. This is an Alberta place. This is a World Heritage place. This is a place that only the ROM is allowed to collect at. This isn't a place that the Royal BC Museum is allowed to collect at. This isn't a place that you're allowed to collect at. But the Burgess Shale really hasn't been any of these places for pretty much the entirety of its existence. It has not been in Alberta. It has not been in BC. And what this means is that place is also time. So there are a lot of these sort of portmanteau hybrid concepts in different disciplines, and I'm so thankful to be a bad sociologist because I love to read all different types of disciplines on the things that I'm curious about. The geologic time scale is a hybrid concept, right? Geology and time, rocks tell time. Space time, a concept from physics, which describes the relativism of observers' perceptions of where and when events happen, and natural cultural analyses, particularly from science studies, which decenter the human-centric lens of most of the social sciences. So what I'm proposing is this notion of deep geologic space-time. And really, I'm trying to make this argument that the Cambrian, which is the era or the epoch in which the Burgess Shale was laid down, the Cambrian is contemporary. It is as contemporary as it is ancient in the Burgess Shale. And despite what we sociologists may prefer to argue, rocks do tell a story that is more than just what humans make of it. And as Stephen Jay Gould wrote in his incredible bestseller book about the Burgess Shale, these are grubby little creatures of a sea floor 530 million years ago, but we greet them with awe because they are the old ones and they are trying to tell us something. So, Wither Anthropocene. This really raises important queries for debates about climate crisis and the Anthropocene in which human activity is centralized as a planetary force. I'm not saying that it's not, but what does that mean to say that the human has the capacity to shape the planet in a planet that has been shaped so profoundly and is continuing to be shaped by the rocks that are a part of that planet? We need to ask some more hard questions. What does it mean to be human anyway? And to challenge our sense of hubris by embracing ambivalence? I don't know. Nonlinearity? I don't know. What else? What can we do to grapple with what it means to be human on the planet today? And so I leave you with a kind of sense of melancholia, I think, from another famous work in which the concept of deep time was coined, basin and range. We as geologists are fortunate to live in a period of great road building, and we sociologists too. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was fascinating. And as a philosopher, I'm currently thinking about places, also time, and the implications of that statement in a more general way too. So now we have about 9-10 minutes for questions. Would you prefer to sort of field those, or would you like?
Yeah, I can do that. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm just looking at the chat. I did see a couple of things pop up in the chat while I was speaking, so I want to see if there's anything in there. Perry says, I injured my leg before my first Burgess trip, and it was so painful. The second and third trips were more relaxing. The Mount Stephen trilobite beds, which are close by, are straight up Mount Stephen, and it was okay, and I was prepared. And then Dan says, Rebecca rocks. And Sue says, thank you for a fun way to spend lunch. Thank you, Sue. Mark.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Becky. Really fun presentation. I'm just kind of curious, when you approach students with the concept that sociology should include the more than human, do they find that, like, yeah, of course, like, obvious that it should? Like, I'm just wondering, like, how do students, what's your experience been with students, introducing these concepts?
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. Thanks so much for the question. So I find that intro students, I feel there's a kind of intuitive sense from intro students, like students who are being exposed to sociology for the first time, I'll put it like that, that the world is more than human. And I find that actually when you take more advanced sociological training, it's almost like you tend to forget that. You get really stuck in the world of social structures. So I find that students that are being exposed to sociology for the first time are really, it really kind of resonates that with them to think about a more than human sociology. I also I think that it's really really fun to be provocative about what a sociologist can be and do, and to try and model that for students, to say that It's fantastic to think about the human world, and thinking from a human-centric point of view is definitely, it's a valid approach and methodology in sociology. But what might it mean to think about the non-human world through the skills that you've been learning in these courses? And that kind of flip is really, it invites a lot of new exploration for students who have taken more traditional, or say canonical, sociological training. And one of the places, ironically, that I think it comes out the most is when I teach sociology of technology, because suddenly students really need to grapple with material culture, and they find it difficult, in my experience, to grapple with material culture in ways that are
You just were muted, I think.
yeah,
There, you're back. Yeah.
it said someone in the meeting muted me. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, it's really difficult to grapple with studying technology. And so I actually find this a really ironic thing of like, okay, well, let's talk about fossils. Let's talk about fossils, and that will help you to think about technology. And I start with this idea that a fossil actually is a technology. It's a technology of knowledge in the Smithsonian and in the ROM. And in the case of my backyard, it's a technology of landscaping. Thanks, Mark. And
That's
then
awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another one, another hand. Now I can't see who it was. I apologize.
It's me, Becky.
Dan.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. How about you?
Yeah, I've got a question. I was pleased to hear you talk about bad sociology, because I consider myself a bad sociologist. And I
Rise up.
What might be a bad question, I'm not sure. I missed the first little bit of your presentation, which was delivered with such energy. I really enjoyed it. On the question of the ontology of objects, I was wondering, did you engage with actor network theory, or any of like Bruno Latour's science and technology studies work, which tries to think about objects as actors? Or
Yes.
Even the more kind of heady spheres of object-oriented ontology?
Yes, you are evoking all of my heroes, and certainly the book that I'm writing is envisioned to be predominantly ontological queries, like what is the nature of a fossil, what is the reality of a fossil, new materialisms. And when I do my work in the paleontological collections, and when I do ethnographic research, I'm drawing directly from the Latour laboratory life approach and the actor network approach. So, I'm taking notes not just of what the humans are doing, in fact, predominantly not what the humans are doing, but I'm trying to record the actants, as Latour would say, that are present in the space. So one of the things that I love to record data about is dust. And if you go to paleontological spaces, I'm not sure how many of my friends here have been to like a paleontological space, not a display, not an exhibit, but an actual like lab or collection. It is probably the dustiest place I've ever been in my life. And paleontologists, bless them, love and blessings, are hoarders, and there is tons and tons and tons of stuff in every paleontological place that you go to. So sometimes you can actually do a dig in a paleontological collection or a lab just by like picking up some of the books that are stacked like a mile high of reprints of papers from 100 years ago, and dig through and say, hey, whose papers were these? Oh, that was the curator that retired in 1980. This is the best. Say they might say something like, this is a priceless collection of articles on Bukia. It is the best in the world, and it's just a stack of papers that's stuck in an office somewhere, gathering dust, not coordinated in any way, not accessible, but it's the best in the world. So it's really interesting to see how they sort of create conditions of value and devalue in this sort of spatial organization of these places, and how dust tells a lot of interesting stories as well. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Becky.
I'm going to look in the chat. So it looks like a few people here have been to the Burgess Shale. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Shelley. And thanks, Perry. Anything? Are there any other questions or thoughts? What do I always say? Questions, complaints, queries, criticisms, and Kardashians. Julia.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So I thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. I just have a quick question about like the Burgess Shale fossils. Those organisms are wild. Like they're like really spark the imagination about what life is.
Yes, yes.
And I'm wondering if you're going to explore that angle. And you probably heard when you went on your tour that some of those fossils were the ideas were used to develop some of the creatures in the Star Wars franchise.
I didn't hear that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, do tell. Tell me more.
Well, we can chat outside the presentation, but the guy did say, he showed us when I went with the Geoscience Center tour, he said, oh, this is whatever it was. This was a few years ago. He said, last seen at a bar on Tatooine.
Oh, okay. That's awesome.
Which, of course, my son picked up on immediately.
Right, right. Yeah, I think you were saying that your son was working in Yoho.
Oh, he worked at the Royal Tyrrell Museum for a long time.
Oh, at the Royal Tyrrell. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
But I'm just curious about the fantasticness of the creatures.
All I can say, Julia, is same, hard same. Like I'm curious about the Fed, and I think that's part of what I was trying to say at the beginning around like how the privilege that I have to be a sociologist, being like, look at this thing, and it's totally acceptable. Like this is a special place. Like, we're in a university where that research is so heartily supported. I just feel so honored. But I think that also exploring like what it means for something to be, as you call it, wild or wacky or really strange, it further enables these sort of like broader theoretical imagination. Like you're kind of like, okay, this critter had 5 eyes. Well,
right.
Like, what does it mean to see through 2 eyes today? 2-eyed seeing, for example, right? So I think it at minimum, I can say at this point that I'm really leaning hard into the feeling, the affect of, wow, this is so cool. And really exploring the affect of it as part of the ways that fossils tell time and how they carve out our experiences of our world. Like you can't even imagine the feeling that I had when I looked down and I said, hey, is that a fossil? Is that a fossil? And I picked it up and it was. So I think affect is also a part of new materialism, sort of thinking about the flows and the materiality of the body and how it experiences a world phenomenologically and how it takes up the world. And now that I've been to these collections that have all this dust, I know that I've got like dust in my pores. I've got like it's stardust, right? But it's like fossil dust because they kind of cut the rocks and stuff too. I know I've got like fossil dust in my body, right? That sort of corporeal gifting thing, which I think goes again to this question of what does it mean to be human, which turns out to be a sociology and a paleontology question.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. So I can see we're a little over time, so we may as well end it.
Yeah, I think that is it. Thank you again so much, Rebecca, for a great discussion.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. I really loved the experience, and thank you so much for the time you spent today. I'm really honored that you spent this time.
And hopefully we will see many of you at the next one, since there is such a nice overlap as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's great. Thank you. Thanks so much.